Welcome to the Prepared for Environmental Change webinar series. My name is Andrea Webster. I work with IU's Environmental Resilience Institute, and we are very pleased to be back from our brief summer hiatus. We've announced an entire year's worth of topics that we plan to cover over the next 12 months, and we've committed to addressing racial equity in each one. So I hope you'll be able to join us throughout the year. So today's webinar is on a new model solar ordinance that will release for Indiana later this month. And we'll hear from another speaker from Porter County who will tell us about his process for adopting an ordinance within his jurisdiction. Before we get started, I want to let you know that everyone's muted. Please enter your questions into the chat function. Even as you think of the questions, that's totally fine with us. But we'll probably address most of the questions after the presentations. You can access that question, the chat function, by hovering your mouse over the Zoom window, and you should see a chat icon pop up. We'll be live tweeting today's webinar from @PreparedForChange, and we are recording the webinar. I'll share that link to the recording along with any follow-up resources with all registrants early next week so that you can share what you've learned with your colleagues. Finally, I'm very pleased to introduce the Director of the Environmental Resilience Institute, Janet McCabe, who will be our moderator today. Janet, pass it to you.
All right. Thanks, Andrea, so much. And hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. We've been doing these virtually even in the days before COVID. So no changes here. We're thrilled to have you. Looks like we have a good crowd already, which illustrates that this is an important topic, I think. So today we're going to be focusing on solar ordinances in Indiana. There have been about 10 county governments and a handful of cities and town governments in Indiana that have adopted solar ordinances. And we're really lucky to have Bob Thompson today with us. He's with the Porter County government in Northwest Indiana. And that is one county that has adopted a solar ordinance. So he's going to share the steps they took to get it adopted earlier this year. And it was a significant effort for Bob and his peers to gather the best practices to put an ordinance together. So that leads me to our second speaker and a project that the Indiana University Environmental Resilience Institute has been working on over the summer. With the Great Plains Institute to develop a best practices model solar ordinance for Indiana. And the goal here is to put tools in the hands of our local governments here in the state so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel or start from scratch, to use two tired cliches, that hopefully will lessen the amount of time and effort they'll have to go to start developing a solar ordinance for their community. This is a model ordinance and it's a best practices ordinance. So we know that communities will tailor whatever they want to do to their specific needs, but we hope that this will get them started and let them see what the good ordinances, what elements they have and what's important. So our second speaker today is going to be Brian Ross from the Great Plains Institute, who's going to go over where we are in developing that model ordinance. It's still a draft at this point, and we've enjoyed a lot of comment from people, and I'm sure we still will. It won't specify every single piece of an ordinance, but describes various design options that local governments can choose from. You'll hear more from Brian about that. I'll introduce both of them in more detail in a minute. I wanted to share, especially for those of you who might be new to ERI and to our webinar series, some of the tools that we have available to help, especially local governments in Indiana. I won't describe these in any detail, but I want to mention them so you'll know that they're out there, and you can easily find them on our website. The Hoosier Resilience Index, a tool where more than, I think, almost 25 communities in Indiana are using the Hoosier Resilience Index to learn more about their own specific vulnerabilities from climate change and do a self-assessment of their readiness for those. We're working with communities across the state to inventory their greenhouse gases and then develop, if they want to, a greenhouse gas mitigation plan. That's been a great program using interns from IU to help with that. The Environmental Resilience Institute Toolkit is kind of our flagship resource where we collect and provide information about climate change and resilience resources, again, targeted towards the kinds of local governments we have here in Indiana, medium to small communities in the Midwest. So you won't find case studies about sea level rise on ERIT, but you will find case studies from your peers around the state of Indiana and things that they have done. We support a podcast here at IU called In This Climate. I get to be one of the co-hosts. It's one of the more fun things that I do. If you're a podcast person and you're looking for yet one more podcast about climate change, you might consider trying ours. We're the Friendly Midwestern Podcasters. We're just starting our second series. And lastly, the Indiana Environmental Reporter, which is a website where there are journalists producing news about environmental issues, a lot of them in Indiana, but also beyond, in a variety of topics. And they're free for anybody to use as long as you say you got them from us. So they're providing a lot of coverage about environmental issues that wouldn't happen otherwise in Indiana if we didn't have them. So please take a look at those. I also want to mention something new we put out, which is results from our Hoosier Life Survey. This is a survey. We sent a survey out to about 10,000 Hoosiers across the state. We got almost 30% return, which is really good. We asked them a whole bunch of questions about what they know or think they know about climate change, who they believe, what kinds of things they are already doing themselves or would like to do, and what kinds of policies they would support. We just issued a series of reports that focus in on metropolitan areas across the state where we had enough respondents that we had a statistically significant set of answers. And so we've provided a report for each community that met those criteria, and with some key metrics and questions that we report on. So there's a fact sheet on each area on our website with lots of good information. I would say that, many of these results are kind of what you would expect, but it's really helpful to see the actual data collected from real Hoosiers. And one of the reasons that our researchers were motivated to do the Hoosier Life Survey is that when you see poll information or survey information results that purport to represent Indiana, most often those are not based on actually surveying Hoosiers. They're based on extrapolations and models. And that's not to say that they're terrible, but they're not as local and not as specific as the Hoosier Life Survey is. So you might want to go look up the ones that are communities that are close to you or you're part of the state and see what you learn from that. I want to thank our webinar co-hosts, Accelerate Indiana Municipalities, Association of Indiana Counties, Health by Design, and the Indiana Public Health Association for their continued support of this webinar series. We really appreciate their making these available to their members so that we can reach as many people as possible. We had a record number of people sign up for the webinar today. I see we've got 80 or so participants. So thank you very much. Again, I think that's because this is an important and interesting topic. You're going to hear a lot about solar energy today, but I want to also make sure that you know about another resource if you want to dive even deeper into solar energy, or really a lot of different resources for local governments on development codes. And that is something called the Sustainable Development Code website, which is a project driven out of Drake University Law School. It is an amazing website and provides for any number of topics a lot of information about best practices, good, better, best examples of codes, and lots of case studies. It's a national website, so not focused specifically on the Midwest, but you might find it useful. And lastly, before I hand it off, Andrea made the point that that in this season of our webinars and in all of our work, really, we are trying to focus more explicitly and deliberately on issues of equity, as I think so many of us are trying to do these days in an era where people are becoming increasingly aware of just how inequitable and unfair many aspects of our modern life are. So we're taking the opportunity to make sure that we look ourselves and learn ourselves, and also point some of these things out. So while I want this to be, and it will be, a very positive topic today, solar energy, which is massively good for society in so many ways, We also should keep in mind that there may be areas there where we need to think about equity in the realm of solar energy. So let's look at a couple of specific facts that Andrea discovered through an Inside Climate News article. According to the article, predominantly white and affluent communities are getting most of the jobs in the solar industry and most of the clean air and financial benefits of having solar on their homes. This is something that I think and hope will change as solar gets more and more prevalent, but it's something that we need to be mindful of. Residential solar installations are more accessible to white people than to people of color, even when you control for differences in income and home ownership rates. Black and or African American workers make up about 7.7% of the solar industry's workforce. They're about 13% of the US labor force overall. People of color may not have the kind of job contacts in the industry that they need compared to white people. Again, these are all things that if we're mindful of, we can work to address. Because I think it's important to notice these things because solar is becoming an increasingly important part of our economy and brings so many benefits to the people who get to take advantage of it. Okay, now I'm going to introduce both of our speakers, Bob first and then Brian, then I'm going to turn it over to Bob, then he's going to turn it over to Brian, and you won't see us again until the end. Andrea and I will be watching the chat function, so please do feel free to put your questions in. And if you don't see me at the end, it's because I have another meeting starting right at 1 and may need to hop off a minute or two early. So Bob Thompson is currently the director of the Department of Development and Stormwater Management for Porter County, Indiana. He's worked with the county for 29 years in various positions, including as assistant county engineer and executive director, county planner. He's the author of the Porter County Solar and Wind Energy Conversion Ordinances. He has an associate's in civil engineering technology and bachelor's in construction technology from Purdue, Calumet, where he graduated with honors. He received a master's in city and regional planning in 1992 from the School of Architecture at Illinois Institute of Technology. And you're welcome to our webinar, even though you graduated from Purdue, Bob. We're glad to have you. Brian Ross is the senior program director at the Great Plains Institute. And he joined that organization after 20 years as a consultant working on sustainable development in local decision-making and implementation. He leads Great Plains Institute's work on solar energy market transformation and manages technical and policy programs to help local, regional, and state governments and institutions meet climate and renewable energy goals. He is an encyclopedia when it comes to these issues. He currently works with local and regional governments developing community standards for using local solar and wind energy sources. And he is the chief author working with us of Indiana's model solar ordinance. So I'm going to hand it off to you, Bob, and look forward to your presentation.
All right, very good. Let me share my screen here. Did that come through? All right. Okay.
Looks great.
I'll try not to mention the other university that I went to and attended, but thank you for the introduction. Porter County, we started in with passive systems and ordinances on that, back in 2009, where, oops, went too far, where we passed a wind energy conversion ordinance, developed that, and then I always wanted to do a solar energy system. And it just sort of sat off on the back burner for a number of years until recently, where we just adopted one just this year. So with that, I did a number of research on that, and American Planning Association, which I'm a member of and was a former national board member up there in one of the chapters for APA, had a number of items that I could do for research, and there's a number of ordinances out there, and I'm going to mention one here in Indiana that I thought was interesting and beneficial, or a technical guide that came in. Like one of the things I did see with the energy systems for solar is they broke it down into two type systems. You have a principal, which is large solar farms, which you see in the top photograph there, and also accessory systems, small systems that supplies energy to the principal structure on the parcel, such as you're seeing as the house there, whether it's roof mounted or it could be structure mounted or it's freestanding on that, like the pictures there. So why did we do a solar ordinance? Well, with the accessory systems, we were dealing with a number of those with homeowners, and I didn't realize that they were starting to become rather popular here within the county. I just wanted to go back and do a little research and see how many of those permits we issued, and I think within a 4-month period, we probably did 10. I thought I saw where they were actually mounting them on the roof or the structure of the house. So I wanted to address that. One of the big items that came across though was Northern Indiana Public Service Company, or NIPSCO, as I'll refer to them, requested proposals a couple of years ago for passive energy systems, wind and solar, to provide power to their grid. Why are they doing that? They wanted to diversify their power generation because they were starting to retire a number of the fossil fuel generators they have. I guess to give an example, south of Porter County and Jasper County, one of the main plants that provides power into Porter County has 4 fossil fuel generators on it, and they're retiring 2 of those by 2024, I think is the date. So because of that request NIPSCO had out, a lot of companies are very interested in submitting proposals into NIPSCO. Matter of fact, we had 3 different developing solar energy developers contact us about this. So we needed to get going, and we had to prevent an ordinance that was coming up or start in with an ordinance. The only way I really had to deal with this coming in, we had 2 small solar farms in the county that are only maybe anywhere from 5 to 10 acres in size. They only provide about 1 megawatt of power into NIPSCO's grid system. The only way we had to deal with that was through use variance, because our current code said that power generation had to be into a very intense industrial district. Well, you know, that's great for the fossil fuel systems, but it's not really proper for the solar. So we started off on researching of the solar industry. So what did we do? The principal solar energy systems I want to talk about first. We made it a permitted use within the agricultural and the industrial districts with the development plan approval from the Plan Commission. Okay, the development plan approval, the way our ordinance is stated is that it's at the Plan Commission, it's a public meeting, but it's not a public hearing. It's a large type item that needs to get in front of the Plan Commission for the approval. We also have administrative type approvals within the development plan, and also our site plan committee that also can approve it. But with some of these systems coming in and asking for anywhere from 700 to 1,400 acres of land used for solar farm, I felt it needed to go in front of the Plan Commission for the development plan approval. Again, public meeting, but not a public hearing. We also, we also provided it for in the rural residential district, and I'll get into our zoning map, which is off to the right here in a minute. But in that area, I wanted it as a special exception from the BZA, then a development plan approval from the Plan Commission. Why the special exception, which is going to be a public hearing, is these are now in the rural residential areas where it might have an effect on the trend of development within that area. And I felt it needed BZA oversight and comment coming in from the public for the approval of that. Now, our zoning map off to the right, the green area is the rural area of Porter County. It's also the agricultural area. That is where it's a permitted use. The purple areas, which is more towards Valparaiso or off some of the communities and everything, on that is our industrial areas. It would be a permitted use in that. The light yellow area is the rural residential area. That's where a special exception would be required from the BZA first. So what are some of the items we wanted within the development plan? The conceptual plan, obviously we wanted that. We wanted to see where they were going to be locating it. They needed to pay attention to the right-of-way, setbacks, the drainage ways, and any easements. One of the items we noticed when talking with two of the companies was they were down in the agricultural area, and they were locating right next to major grid lines that were coming out of that generating station that I mentioned earlier that was retiring to the plants. So they were locating very closely to the large transmission lines and into the agricultural area. So we wanted to make sure, you know, they were out of the drainage ways, since we have a large, extensive agricultural drainage system down there. What else? The transportation plan. We wanted to know where they were going to be bringing in all of the construction equipment and the solar panels and everything on this. So that way our highway engineering department can work with them on developing a letter of credit for the roads to make sure damage wasn't done, or review what their construction plan was with that. Visual impacts. We needed to review this. I'll get into the landscaping plan a little bit different, or a little bit later, excuse me, because we added something that was a little different there. Construction estimate, we just wanted to know the construction jobs that would be created from this and the permanent jobs after the solar system was up and in place. Power utilities commitment to purchase energy. Okay, we wanted a letter from a power company to them saying that, yeah, they're committed to purchasing energy from that. And I did talk to some of the solar developing companies, and they wanted to talk about that one. And it's like, all right, I know you're not going to invest in 1,400 acres of solar panels. So, I mean, if you provide me something saying that the utilities are interested in what utilities, and at least a letter from one of the utilities saying, yeah, we're going to give consideration. I feel that met the intent of one of the requirements under the development plan. Safety plan, identify potential hazards to adjacent properties, public roadways, and the community as a whole. So those are just a few of the items in there. There's some more that we do require within our development plan. But one of the things I wanted to get into was the landscaping plan and the use of a pollinator seed mix for this. Within the landscaping plan, we put it that if they use a pollinator seed mix, native plants, planting it around the solar field, then they're going to be exempt from our other landscaping requirements, which is street trees, buffering from other uses if there is some housing out there in the next to their development, that they would be exempt from having to do any kind of screening and stuff like that, unless the Plan Commission felt it was absolutely necessary that they needed to do something like that. So there was talk of that. But if they did the pollinator mix here on this, then they were going to be exempt from our landscaping ordinances. So this is where I need to give some credit to another group that developed what I thought was an excellent technical guide. The Michiana Area Council of Governments, or MACOG, developed a technical guide for the establishment and maintenance of pollinator-friendly solar projects. This was very good. Matter of fact, I stole this particular diagram from their technical guide, and it shows how we want to see the pollinator-friendly seed mix done for these particular solar panels in the development. Why that? I mean, these are agricultural fields right now. They put in the seed mix and everything. It's going to protect our local watersheds, which is very important to us, especially down in the agricultural area. Water quality benefits would be huge with infiltration with these deep-rooted plants and slowing up the runoff into these ditches. I mean, most know that agricultural runoff is rather huge going into these ditches, and it is also loaded with sediment. So this would really help protect our agricultural drains down in that area. But Again, I would highly recommend if you are researching this, go to the MACOG site and find that technical guide. Very, very good. Here again is there an example of the seed mix. And I say an example is because we did take their seed mix from their technical guide. And our stormwater engineer used to work for the Center for Watershed Protection over in Maryland. And he added his, what he felt was a good mix, maybe a little bit less expensive than what was in the MACOG technical guide, but there's a lot of similarities here on that. So there is your seed mix. What we were looking at for the ordinance. And again, if they stayed with this type of seed mix and these pollinators, they were exempt from our regular landscaping ordinances that we would have. So now on to accessory energy systems. It's a use by right in all of the zoning districts. Single and two-family residential permitted up to 2,000 square feet of panels. It can be on the structure itself. We do have certain requirements that they can't be overhanging past the roof or certain distances off the side of the house. They still have to meet setback requirements. So we have 2,000 square feet for single and two-family residential homes. We also have 40,000 square feet panels for multiple family and also non-residential uses, institutional, industrial, or commercial type uses. I know with the Planning Association, there was a debate going back and forth with the listserv on how to actually do this as far as panels. I mean, there was the debate between, do we list it as square footage or do we list it as kilowatt, the energy on that. Say, I mean, a typical generator that's hooked up to your house in the rural area that might be off of natural gas or something is probably in the area of 16 to 18 kilowatts. So the question is do we do it off of, say, an 18 kilowatt, or do we go by square footage? Well, I don't have the luxury of having a huge planning staff and engineering staff that would be able to dissect these permits coming in. So I went with the square footage, and that is generous. That should provide more than the 16 to 18 kilowatts as a backup generator would, and allow some of the electricity that's created and generated to be put back into the grid system if they have permission to do that from the local energy company. Figured it was a good thing. Why not? Same with the multifamily. And that's probably generous, but if they can supply the energy to their units or their business and put some back in the grid system, why not? I just figured that was a good thing. So, permitting the ground mounted, one of the things we wanted to do was look at the layout, design, make sure it conforms to the industry standards. There's a lot of industry standards you'll see if you research in this. A lot of places down in Florida that I can think of. They need to meet all of the side and rear setbacks for an accessory structure. We still want to have the separation. Didn't get into solar easements very much, but I mean, obviously most people are going to be situating these things away from the property lines, especially if those property lines have trees next to them. They don't want the shade, full sun, obviously. Solar panels shall not be placed in the front yard between the structure and the right-of-way. We want it side behind the house so that we still have a nice visual effect of the architecture of the house or the commercial or institutional buildings that's going on. And the glare. Applicant has the burden to prove, and assure that there's going to be no glare, especially no glare onto any adjoining type structure. Roof and wall mounted, must be located on a primary accessory, cannot exceed the total height by 18 inches above maximum structure height. Wall mounted should comply with all setbacks, meaning if the house is right on the setback line, the panels are going to extend out past, so they're not going to be doing on that wall. They still have to meet side setbacks and rear setbacks and front. Again, shall not extend beyond the roof or wall. They still have to stay within the architecture of the structure and shall meet building codes and prove that the structure can accept panel weight. That's especially necessary up on the roof. We just want to make sure that the roof trusses or the roof structure can still hold the weight of the equipment that will be going up there. So that's pretty much my presentation here on our item. I guess to go real quickly over everything. I mean, with the large systems, one of the things I wanted to make sure that we were solar friendly. So I felt by doing that, making it permitted uses in the industrial and agricultural area with the development plan approval in front of the Plan Commission was making it a solar friendly item. I mean, the one thing I did add was the pollinator on that, but if they did it, they got exempt from our other landscaping type ordinances that are within our Porter County Unified Development Ordinance. So with that, I will turn it over to Brian.
Okay, thank you, Bob. And I will get myself set up here. Okay, can everyone see that then? I'm going to talk a little bit about Indiana's the model solar ordinance that we've been working on with a variety of people. It is still in draft form. We are still taking comments on it, and they only gave me 10 to 15 minutes for this presentation, so I can't go very far into it. I'm going to focus today primarily on primarily on the what we're trying to achieve rather than upon the details of the actual ordinance. Great Plains Institute, for those of you who don't know us, we are a nonprofit organization, been around for 20 years. We have the humble mission of transforming the energy system to benefit the economy and environment. We do a variety of things from working directly with communities on energy efficiency, renewable energy, and related issues, and climate issues, all the way up to working at the federal level on carbon capture and storage legislation and tax benefits, and everything in between that. We do a lot of work in the Midwest. We are based out of Minnesota, and my work is primarily working with communities, mainly in the Midwest, but to some extent on a national basis. I wanted to kind of things that I'm going to go over today in my brief presentation is kind of talk about why solar zoning is, why we're talking about it, why this is really needed and something that is important for communities to consider. Bob has already kind of given a very great example of kind of what they experienced, and we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the bigger picture on this. I want to touch on what the principles of solar-ready zoning are, so that people can see what is the context in which you need to think about this before you start diving into details about what kind of a setback you need or whether or not to make it a permitted use or a conditional use. Then we will talk specifically about kind of some of the standards again and the goals that we're trying to get to for small scale and accessory uses, and then for large scale and principal uses. So kind of the why do we want to do solar zoning now at this point in time, and why should local governments care? Well, one is that the cost has changed dramatically for solar energy. It's already a form of energy generation that's competitive with natural gas generation at the wholesale level, and it is competitive at the retail level with the retail electric rates in most cases. With the ongoing cost decreases that we're going to be seeing in the solar industry, we're going to expect it will be the cheapest form of wholesale electric generation on a kilowatt hour basis of any type within the next few years. And it will probably surpass wind energy, which is now the cheapest or least expensive form of electric generation now. And these cost projections do not include any kind of subsidy, in case people were wondering. Second reason is that the markets, because of the cost, have really dramatically changed. Large energy consumers are seeing the low cost of energy, renewable and clean energy, and are really taking aggressive steps to acquire it. You can kind of see this headline from late last summer. Kind of the corporate investment in clean energy is really surging. A lot of the major corporations in the United States are making big investments directly in acquiring solar and wind energy, and this is something that is going to transform the market for people who are actually looking to sell solar resources and develop solar resources. But second, of course, is the electric utilities are also transitioning to this lower cost renewable energy, and because they're discovering that it's actually cheaper than their existing coal plants on the system to build and operate new renewable energy systems, wind and solar. NIPSCO, of course, in Indiana, being the major utility there, announced, as most of you know, and as Bob has already noted, the plan to transform away from coal and aggressively move into the solar energy space for wholesale generation. Third reason why local governments should care is that in the context of these cost and market changes, the solar resource is something that is very widely distributed. Solar resources can be that can be economically developed are found in every single county in Indiana in a fairly extensive and large quantity. You can think about solar energy now as kind of like you discovered that suddenly every county in Indiana had a big oil resource, and everybody knows that if you have a big reserves like that are economic, people are going to want to develop them, and that's what counties and cities are going to be facing in Indiana as they will across the country. Because they have property owners who basically own this solar resource. They have an economic resource, energy resource on their property. People want to buy it. Big corporations, utilities want to buy it. There are developers out there who are willing to pave the way to make that happen and make that match, so that this is something that every city and county is going to face in Indiana, and indeed, as I said, probably across the country. You could actually look and see what the technical potential for solar resources, the utility scale solar resources are in Indiana. The National Renewable Energy Lab has actually estimated this for every single county in the nation. And there's a lot of numbers here that people may not understand, but we try to put that into context of a single county that might have 55 to 100,000 megawatt hours of technical potential for utility scale solar development. That's approaching the total amount of electric consumption in the state in 2020. So you can see that the resource is huge, the technical potential is huge, and there's a lot of people out there looking to develop this and create fill those market needs. So that's kind of why this needs to happen, and why the importance of kind of understanding what kind of market pressure is going to be on counties and cities to develop these resources. Now I want to talk just a little bit about kind of what the principles of solar-ready zoning are. These are things we have drawn from a couple of different resources. We've been operated in the Midwest a program, or along with some of our partners, operated a program called the Grow Solar program that is still active over at the Midwest Renewable Energy Association in Wisconsin. And we developed a set of principles for solar readiness, including comprehensive planning, zoning, permitting, investment in public resources, and economic development as kind of standards for solar ready. And for the zoning piece, we have a kind of a separate set of standards that we developed, which is, in order to be solar ready, your zoning ordinance needs to explicitly recognize and address the different forms and uses of solar energy, because solar is not all one thing, as Bob has kind of already explained and demonstrated in Porter County. You want to also create by right installation opportunities as much as possible. People want to develop this. You need to identify when you can allow them to do so without having to go through special permitting. Some special permitting is almost, in certain circumstances, is always going to be necessary, and as Bob kind of described, for the larger systems, it's probably going to be more likely to be necessary. But still, to create those by right installation opportunities is a concept and a principle of solar-ready zoning. Third is you want to make sure that you're setting clear and predictable standards for solar resources and development and that balances with other resources and land uses. Solar resources are a great thing inside of a city. Urban tree canopies are a great thing inside of a city. They don't go well together, and both of those things are good, and you need to kind of balance that. That's the role of zoning by local governments, is to take these two things that might be in conflict and find ways that they can coexist, or to find two things that are in synergy and make sure that they are coupled together. So kind of these clear and predictable standards are really important, so that there's not, so that when a developer or a landowner or a homeowner comes up to the counter at your zoning office, they know what needs to be provided to the local government. The local government knows what they are expecting from the person on the other side of the counter, so that counter, there's a balance across that, and an understanding of what those standards are going to be. Third, principles of solar-ready zoning need to enable capture of desired co-benefits, and this is where solar has synergies with other kinds of things that are desirable to the community. And Bob kind of talked about that specifically with solar and the water quality benefits that they had captured and were very important to the county, kind of protecting surface waters of the county, and making sure that the solar development as it went in was actually enhancing, to the extent that that could be coupled with the development, the benefit and local benefit, and that the community there desired. And then finally, to maintain consistency with regional best practices. We would really like to see, and the industry needs to see, a consistency across local governments, so that there's not a patchwork of different kinds of zoning standards that are applied in one county or one city versus another. We want to have some kind of common foundation upon which local governments can move from uncertainty to certainty about what needs to happen relative to their neighbors and relative to the industry, and that there is a better opportunity for the communities to work in synergy with their own landowners who want to develop, and with developers who are facilitating that process. And it is the kind of maintaining consistency with regional best practices that we're trying to get to, and what we approached the Environmental Resilience Institute about whether or not they'd be interested in kind of trying to set some regional best practices, so that there's a place for local governments to go that is a third party, not having an economic interest source of information. One of the things that is important in those principles, zoning principles, is to really think about solar as a land use. And again, we've already heard a great example from Bob about what Porter County did, but there's kind of two different considerations here. One is to consider the specific land use, and there's really 4 different kinds of land uses that we start with in terms of solar development. There's roof-mounted, ground-mounted, community-scale systems, and large-scale systems. And there's some overlap between those. Obviously, both the community-scale and large-scale systems are almost always, not always, but almost always going to be a ground-mounted system. But it is at a different scale, and it fits into the landscape in different ways. And so we kind of see these are kind of ideas and concepts that communities can think about and start from when they think about how to really considering the land use. Don't regulate your large-scale systems the same way you do your roof-mounted systems. There's certain things that do come into play with large-scale that don't come into play with roof-mounted, and vice versa. Second, you need to consider the context. Is it an accessory use or a principal use? And this is something that zoning officials in cities are very familiar with. But one of the things we do want to emphasize is that with some solar resources, it may not be always obvious what is an accessory use and a principal use. And you need to be a little careful about how you define those in your zoning ordinance. We see some very large solar arrays that are actually accessory uses, and we see some rather small solar arrays that are actually principal uses. And so there's some kind of definitional issues that you need to be careful of in your zoning ordinance. So I wanted to talk now about some of the specifics or goals about small scale and accessory use solar that we're working with. There is a set of zoning best practices, and this largely comes out of the National Soul Smart program, which is a certification program across the nation for local governments to be solar ready. And this is kind of we at GPI work very closely with the Soul Smart program nationally. We're on the national team that is serving a variety of local governments and helping shape the program, as well as we were the largest technical advisor contractor in the nation for the Soul Smart program over the last 3 years. The kind of things that we talk about in terms of principles are outlined here pretty clearly. By right accessory use. Make sure that these things are allowed by right in all major zoning districts. Make sure that you address specifically the height standards in a way that makes sense from the solar resource standpoint. Sometimes you may have to have a height restriction waived or have an exemption for it in order to capture solar resources, particularly on small lots. Accessory uses sometimes have a limited number on a given lot or a coverage ratio, and you need to think about whether or not that really makes sense when you're talking about solar. Do you exempt solar from counting on those things? Aesthetic requirements are a very big deal, and this is something we see for both large scale and small scale. There's a lot of mistakes that are made, we think, in best practices around aesthetic requirements, and we have a set of things to address there. Specifically to recognize that things like screening of solar equipment affects the functionality of the equipment. It doesn't do any good to put a fence around a solar system to keep it from view, because it will shade it. And there are exceptions on similar kinds of equipment that are already allowed in almost every zoning ordinance in the county, in the country, where things like chimneys are allowed, or even sometimes HVAC equipment that's outside the building is allowed to have an exception from a height standard or a setback standard in order to allow for the functionality of it. Similarly, things like setbacks, roof coverage, glare. I noted that Bob had in his ordinance that glare had to be proved by the jurisdiction. Generally, we find, or by the person who's putting it up, generally we find that glare studies or these kinds of proof are not needed unless solar is really on or adjacent to an airport. Especially in a residential district, there's more glare from windows than there is ever going to be from solar arrays. And glare is reflected light in this case. And you're kind of being arbitrary if you say we're going to regulate glare from the reflected solar array, but we're not going to regulate glare from the reflected from the windows. That's an arbitrary decision. It's the exact same thing. You need to be careful of that. Anyway, so I'll just kind of move on from this, kind of a couple of specific examples. We do take these principles and actually apply them to Indiana enabling statutes. And one of the things that's in Indiana, and that many people on the call probably are already aware of, is that there is a limitation on what local governments can do in terms of passing ordinances that restrict solar energy. A unit of local government may not adopt an ordinance which has the effect of prohibiting or unreasonably restricting the use of solar energy. You do have a couple of windows for regulation on that, but you can't significantly increase the cost of the system, or you must allow for an alternative system of comparable cost or efficiency in any of the regulations you have. And this really is mainly going to affect your aesthetic standards. And so one of the things that we did in the model ordinance was we actually addressed the visibility issue specifically to make sure that Indiana Statute 32728 is addressed in your whatever kind of visibility or aesthetic standards you have. We have some kind of text box guidance that we use for that, and to recognize that this is actually a separate issue from historic or heritage preservation standards, which have a different kind of statutory grounding. So now let's talk a little bit about large scale and principal use solar and some of the things that we talk about in terms of principles for and best practices for large scale solar. Similar to the small scale, you really need to carefully define your terms, and there's several kind of recommendations there to both recognize large scale solar as a unique land use. It is not an industrial land use. Many local governments start there, and there's a characterization of it. An industrial land use is defined as industrial because of the nuisances associated with it and the characteristics of it. Solar has almost none of those. Large-scale solar, even very large solar arrays, are not industrial land uses. You should allow for and include storage as a component of large-scale solar in your ordinance in order to kind of clearly set the stage for that as it becomes increasingly part of the development of solar. You need to distinguish between your small and your large-scale systems by area. We have recommended a community scale size and a large-scale size. We have seen communities that have decided to lump everything together, and that can be okay. We have seen communities that have broken out into a finer grain, into a small, medium, and large size, depending on how they want to regulate it. You should only break it out separately, though, if you're going to regulate it differently. If there's a reason to regulate it differently, then break it out. If there's not a reason to regulate it differently, then there's no reason to break it out and to distinguish. You do need to enable development to occur. Most large-scale solar is, of course, a principal use, and if you don't call it out by name in your ordinance, it's not going to be permitted. And you're going to have people coming in and asking for zoning change and text amendments. And really what you need to do is kind of identify how you're going to enable that to happen in a proactive, transparent, and predictable way. Regulate by land use, not by energy use. And Bob kind of got to this on their accessory use when they regulated by the square footage rather than by the kilowatt. And there's some similar recommendations we would say with large-scale solar, although there is a trade-off, but to regulate it by the land area that's being used rather than by the capacity of the system. Although, like I said, there's some trade-offs you have to be careful of in that. Recognize the land use differences between solar and non-solar issues. Things like coverage limits, which are designed to address on large-scale buildings, are not necessarily appropriate for solar. In fact, we would say that they need to be exempt from coverage limits, and those kinds of issues need to be addressed in different ways, particularly around the impervious surface question. To capture the co-benefits, enabling things that are important to your community. Habitat-friendly ground cover, making sure there's an opportunity where it's appropriate to do things like co-location of agricultural uses. Sometimes that would take the place of the ground cover kind of standards, and to enable water quality, surface and groundwater improvements where those things can create synergy with your solar development. Those are actually things that are fairly straightforward. We have seen almost in every case that a large-scale solar development, when it's replacing row crop agriculture, is going to result in a water quality improvement to the community, and that should be recognized in your ordinances. Screening requirements, setback, glare again, and then decommissioning are also things for which there's best practices. And I'm trying to move on here to kind of not use up all the time. The kind of things we ask the communities kind of look at is, one, siting. Where do you want to allow this and where do you not want to allow it? Community scale, the smaller it is something that in the model we're looking at as an example, a 10-acre or smaller development. I've actually seen some people go up to 20 acres or even 50 acres or smaller, depending on what kind of community you're in, where it is a kind of development that can fit into the landscape of the community in a way that is different than a large-scale development, which may be hundreds or thousands of acres even, where it's not something that's going to fit into the fabric of the community very easily, and it needs to be addressed in a little differently. Generally, for community scale, you can permit it by right in certain districts. Generally, for large scale, it will be permitted through a conditional use or special permit process. And Bob gave the example of allowing it as a permitted use, but having a design review that still requires planning commission approval. The second element is site design elements, and this is where we kind of try to get to things like setbacks, screening, ground cover, buffer areas, power and communication lines, fencing. These kinds of things have turned up as barriers to solar development going in, and we need to make sure that people are not regulating these in ways that are untenable. We have seen people, certain counties in some places, create very large setbacks from certain uses. In fact, setbacks that are in excess of what they require for almost any other land use. And that's simply not justified for a large-scale solar, particularly if you're also going to require screening. When you screen a large-scale solar array from, for instance, a residential property or even a commercial property, the setback doesn't need to be nearly as big. Similarly, if you're going to have a large setback, the screening requirements should be commensurately reduced, because the main impact of solar on the adjacent land use is going to be visual. There's virtually nothing else that you're ever going to find from a solar array that is going to affect an adjacent land other than the visual impact. Things like power and communication lines and how those get structured have actually been a problem for some communities, as has fencing. And then just some of the other elements that are also in the model ordinance is how you interact with other land uses and resource priorities. Airports are an important thing. How do you do solar around those? Water quality, natural systems, agriculture, growth management standards. Where are you going to planning to expand the city? Where are you not going to expand it? And then, of course, other codes and standards, and decommissioning is something that should be applied and is addressed in the model ordinance. So I see Andrea's on, probably ready to remind me to stop, so I am done.
All right. Thank you, Brian. And thank you, Bob, for both of your presentations. You can tell you're both a wealth of information for the state of Indiana, so we really appreciate what you had to share with us today. So we have a number of questions that have come through, and I know that we're heading up on 1 o'clock here Central, 1 o'clock Eastern, and so we'll probably go a couple minutes over to get through a few more questions. So some of the questions that popped up first, let's see. Sorry, my chat box disappeared once the screen stopped being shared. Okay, so Bob, one question that came through for you was whether you considered solar grazing and info from the American Solar Grazing Association.
No, we did not take into account on that. I guess I'd be honest with you, I did not know of that nor researched it. So, I mean, I found it an interesting question, and I might end up diving into that and looking at it a little bit. If it's something that's the solar developer and the landowner can agree upon, I can see an amendment to our ordinance would go through quickly.
Great. And while you're up, do you want to explain your position, Bob, and whether or not it's the same as a county surveyor?
It is not the same as a county surveyor. I was the executive director of the Porter County Plan Commission, and we were looking at trying to get a stormwater system in, other than we had the drainage board with the regulated drains. So I came up with a fee system for the unincorporated area of the county. The commissioners looked at me and said, great, form the department. So I did, and hired engineers for the stormwater section, and they came in and said, hey, you did such a nice job, here's the highway engineering also. So basically they gave me all of the engineering. It's very, I guess, really close to being almost like a public works type department. So I'm director over all of the engineering of the county, the GIS, the building, the planning, the zoning. So.
And typically a solar ordinance would come out of a planning department, correct? Yeah. Yeah, of course, every local government is set up differently.
Yes.
All right, so here's a question that might be for one or both of you. So if a solar system cannot be raised above the roof, what happens with a system that will be mounted on a flat roofed building?
Well, the ordinance that we've developed does distinguish between a pitched roof and a flat roof. That the height standard and the over a roof is generally one. Well, there's actually a separate height standard above the roof that we would include for a pitched roof versus a flat roof. Obviously, for residential buildings, they're going to tend to be pitched in the Midwest, and flat roofs are going to tend to be commercial. And there is some variability in those standards that we see across across the nation, that usually what we recommend on a pitch roof is that it should be flush mounted to the roof. And flush mounted means parallel to the roof, not actually right up against it. But there's no real reason to pitch the solar array on a pitched roof steeper than the roof itself, except unless it's a very, very shallow pitch. On flat roofs, you must pitch it because putting it flat on the roof will really limit its effectiveness. And you can usually do that by keeping it usually less than 5 feet above the roof, but we do see a lot of people on commercial buildings will allow for as much as 10 feet higher than the roof for those kinds of systems.
And Brian, related to your slide that showed solar potential, can you explain what technical potential is, and then explain why there are certain counties in northern Indiana that are better for solar and others that are not, according to that map of Indiana?
Yeah, and it's an interesting question, and it was an algorithm that was run by the National Renewable Energy Lab that took into account let's see, there's a set of data called LIDAR that is very accurate, and it basically can, from that data, by airplanes flying over and taking laser measurements, they can actually compute what the areas are that are shaded and which areas are not shaded on an annual basis. And so they kind of start with that and look at, and so an area that has a lot of tree cover is going to show a lot less than an area that is all farmland. They also then took into account certain kinds of land uses, and anything that was in a protected area like a state park or kind of those conservation areas were taken off the table, as were, when you're looking at utility scale solar, anything that is in the urban footprint. You're not going to develop a utility scale system in a city where there's residential housing. You might find a place for some community scale, but the utility scale definition that they used was for basically hundreds or thousands of acres. And so they looked at the kind of contiguous landform of what could be developed there, and they did then add up everything from that and say, what if we develop that full set of solar across the entire county? And that's the technical potential. Obviously, that's not going to happen, because if you did that for a single county, you generate almost enough electricity in many cases to supply the entire state with electricity. So that's not the question. It's just to demonstrate how broad-based this resource is, and it is, the technical potential is targeted at resources that are economic in the current market.
And speaking of that economic opportunity, I mean, we know that renewable energy projects are economic opportunities for rural communities. And with the cost of developing solar projects declining, does the draft ordinance take into account the cost of compliance with all the requirements in aggregate and ensure that a solar project is still financially viable for the developer and for the economically beneficial to the community and landowner? I know that was a long question. It's also in the chat if you want to take a look.
Yeah. All of the provisions that are in the solar ordinance are things that have been used by local governments specifically to either mitigate for things or to capture co-benefits or to shape the development in order to match the community standard. And all of those things that are in there have been done for projects that have been successful. So I mean, if you did everything in there, have we added up what the total cost is? No, we haven't. But hardly anybody is likely to use the full portfolio of options on any given project. And there are opportunities to selectively choose which things make the most sense for your community. Just for instance, the pollinator ground cover that Bob was talking about in his ordinance versus the solar grazing example that was raised earlier, are both in the model ordinance, but you can't do both simultaneously. What the ordinance does is it basically say, these are two different options that you can do, and you should think about when you're developing your solar ordinance, how they fit within your community's priorities.
Great, and I mean, related to the native pollinator vegetation, Bob, did you have any allies providing a carrot for seeding solar projects with native pollinator vegetation?
Yes, and I saw that question came from Bob Drury, so I have to say hello to Bob. Haven't seen Bob in a while. I guess one of the main things I was going back and forth for is when I was looking at the principal solar systems and everything like that, is how do I go about taking in this application? Originally, I was thinking of doing it as a special exception and having certain requirements under a special exception they had to meet. And one of the things I kind of noticed, and I did actually sit face to face with a couple of these solar companies before the COVID set in, and I noticed that when I mentioned a public hearing, they got nervous. And I could understand it. So then I kicked it in and I said, you know, if we're not going to do a special exception, we're going to do this by right and permitted use within the district, then I want to lay out all of the standards that they're going to have. And I saw some examples. I saw that NACOG technical guide, and I thought, well, that's really great. It's going to provide a lot of benefits with that. So the ideal is if, you know, this is what we want done. If you want to go forward with the development plan, if you don't like it and everything like that, okay, that's going to kick in a waiver. Now you got your public hearing, because they're going to have to request something different from our development standards in there. So one of the things I really wanted to do was set very reasonable development standards on that, but also set something that would be visually appealing and also benefit the area.
All right, well, thank you. We have one more question here, and this is with regard to the model ordinance. So Brian, is there any language in the model ordinance to distinguish between projects on brownfields versus greenfields, and any encouragement for brownfield siting?
That's a good question, and and the intent was, yes, to do that. I'm pretty sure that, however, we did not specifically put it into the use table. It might be a good addition to make, and it is one of those things that we certainly have worked with a number of communities on, is to how do you enable solar development on areas that are otherwise difficult to develop, such as a brownfield. Closed landfills, those kinds of things. It does get a little tricky depending on your state standards. And I can't say that I am really familiar with Indiana and the opportunities that are specific to your state in terms of kind of brownfield development. Illinois did have a incentive program that they put into their solar program that is trying to stimulate solar development in the state. In Minnesota, however, there was no such incentive built in, and in fact, there was a substantial disincentive that was inadvertently built into the way that the state had managed closed landfills and a lot of brownfield sites, because they had done a very good job of it. But by virtue of that, they had basically helped clean them up using general obligation bonds, which then limited the ability to develop it for a revenue-producing project. So we're kind of negotiating that now and seeing how we move forward with that. But from a land use standpoint, absolutely, local governments should be identifying those areas that are marginal use for other kinds of development or other kinds of land uses, and saying, can we use this for solar? One of those an example of that is actually the lands around airports, where you do not want buildings, right? And you do not want people. And in fact, you don't really even want wildlife in many cases, at least not birds. And that's a great place for solar. You have to do it in a way that matches and is in conjunction with the use of the airport, such that it doesn't affect it. But it's otherwise a marginal land that's difficult to develop that actually is a perfect use for solar.
All right. Well, thank you so much to both of you. And you know, I want to mention too that we're really excited to release this model solar ordinance. It is just that it's a model, and we understand that all the local governments across the state are going to take it and implement the best practices and tweak other things. So we look forward to seeing this spread across the state. I want to especially thank Brian and Bob for sticking around for a few extra minutes here, and to all of our attendees. So thanks for a great webinar. We'll be sending out the recording early next week, and we'll look forward to working with all of you more. Take care, everyone.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.